This PowerPoint will explore the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990, 1997, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. Many educators hear the acronyms IDEA or IDEIA and are unsure of how these acts began, or only view them as a more recent enactment in education. IDEA and IDEIA actually goes back to 1975, beginning with the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Congress found that more than 8 million children in the United States with disabilities had needs that had not been fully met, and over 1 million of these children with disabilities had received no form of public education opportunities. The students who were able to receive public education did not receive full benefits, as their disabilities had not been covered. Due to this, an unnecessary strain was placed on parents to ensure their students were receiving an education that was appropriate for them, rather than school systems being held responsible. As the number of students with disabilities rose in the United States, amendments were passed to help meet the needs of students with disabilities. The passage of the 1975 Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or EAHCA, was no longer enough. These evolved into Public Law 101-476, also known as IDEA, which called for significant changes to Public Law 94-142, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This stated traumatic brain injury and autism would be included in the new disability categories. Additionally, Congress mandated that as part of a student's IEP, it must be developed to help the student transition to post-secondary life. On June 4, 1997, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. President Clinton reauthorized IDEA with several new amendments. These amendments emphasized the importance of providing all students with access to the same curriculum, and under this act, states were given the authority to expand the developmental delay definition from birth through 5 years of age to also include students between the ages of 6 and 9 years old. On December 3, 2004, Congress then amended IDEA, or we also know this as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. Congress called for early intervention for students, greater accountability, and improved educational outcomes. Congress also raised the standards for instructors who teach special education classes. It also required states to demand that local school districts shift up to 15% of their special education funds toward general education if it was determined that a disproportionate number of students from minority groups were placed in special education for reasons other than disability. The U.S. Department of Education's website outlines this history, which is very beneficial to educators, so that they may see how various amendments have been passed to accommodate the growing needs of students identified with disabilities. The passage of EAHCA came from Congress's decision that the federal government needed to intervene in the education of children with disabilities. In the early 1970s, there were two court cases that helped bring attention to the importance of education of children with disabilities. The first of which was the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus the Commonwealth. In this case, a district court ruled that the state's children with mental retardation were entitled to a free public education and whenever possible should be educated in regular classrooms rather than classrooms that were isolated from the normal school population. This court stated, a free public program of education and training appropriate to the child's capacity within the context of a presumption that among the alternative programs of education and training required by statutes to be available, placement in a regular public school class is preferable to placement in a special public school class. Further, placement in a special public school class is preferable to placement in any other type of program of education and training. The second court case, Mills versus Board of Education, challenged the exclusion of children with disabilities from the District of Columbia public schools, which resulted in the denial of a publicly supported education. The court stated that no child eligible for a publicly supported education should be excluded from a regular public school assignment by a rule, policy, or board policy unless such child is provided adequate alternative educational services consistent with the child's needs, which may also include special education or tuition grants. Further, if the child is to be reassigned or provided other alternatives, procedural due process shall be required. These two cases show that nationwide, children with disabilities needed to be a priority, and the pressures from political campaigns, as well as these decisions of these court cases, resulted in the passage of federal legislation by Congress. Individuals with disabilities are protected under 3 statutes from discrimination and provided with equal access to educational opportunities, facility utilization, and employment opportunities in public school settings. These 3 statutes are IDEA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504. Under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, schools must guarantee that programs, services, and activities are accessible and responsive to the needs of individuals with disabilities when the district's programs and activities are considered in their entirety. Students who do qualify under 504 are provided an individual accommodation plan, also known as an IAP. The Individuals with Disabilities Act of 1990, or IDEA, was passed by Congress to define clearly the responsibilities of school districts regarding children with disabilities and to provide a measure of financial support to assist states in meeting their obligations. IDEA guarantees children with disabilities ages 3 to 21 the right to a free, appropriate education in public schools. A free, appropriate education, as defined under Section 504, includes regular or special education and related services designed to meet the individual needs of students consistent with the provisions involving evaluation, placement, and procedural safeguards. Under IDEA, disabilities are defined. Interpretation and identification of children with disabilities means that those who meet the following conditions: mental retardation, hearing impairments, which include deafness, speech or language impairment, visual impairment, including blindness, learning disabilities, brain injury, emotional disturbance, orthopedic impairments, autism, traumatic brain injury, specific learning disabilities, and other impairments who, by reason of such conditions, need special education and related services. The passage of IDEA resulted in increased accountability. IDEA requires each state to identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities ages birth to 21 years who are in need of early intervention or special education services. This passage of IDEA was not intended to guarantee a certain level of education, but rather open the door of education to children with disabilities by means of special education services. With the variety of disabilities, IDEA does not require a quality of results. It merely requires that children with disabilities benefit from instruction. Since IDEA is an amendment to EAHCA, it is important to note that IDEA obligated school districts to pay for the range of services agreed to in a student's individual education plan, or IEP, regardless of the level of federal and state funding earmarked for the education of children with disabilities. Under IDEA of 1997, amendments were designed to provide greater flexibility to school districts without violating the rights of students who were disabled. Discipline with respect to suspension, manifestation, and interim alternative education settings are addressed. The following is a summary of the applicable provisions under IDEA 1997. In regards to discipline and optional sanctions, when a student violates a school rule or code of conduct that is uniformly applicable to all students, the school district, or LEA, acting through the student's IEP team, may take one of several actions. If the school district has not already conducted a functional behavioral assessment and implemented a behavioral intervention, then the IEP team must develop an assessment plan to address the student's behavior. Or, if the school district has already developed such a plan and put it into the student's IEP, then the team must review the plan and modify it as necessary to address the behavior for which the student was disciplined. Before the school district imposes any sanction, the IEP team and any other qualified personnel must notify the student's parents of the decision and of the student's and parents' procedural safeguards. This must occur no later than 10 days after making the decision, and review the relationship between the student's disability and the student's behavior. When conducting this determination review, the IEP team must determine that the behavior was not a manifestation of the disability if it complies with two requirements. A parent may appeal the determination concerning no manifestation, or any discipline-related placement decision. The student remains in the IAES pending the decision of the hearing officer for up to 45 days unless the parents and the school district agree otherwise. The significance of the changes is that the IEP serves as the link between the non-discriminatory education and the LRE placement. These amendments make this connection more explicit. There is also a very strong component of the LRE found in the IEP. The IEP team must include a general educator who can provide appropriate and positive interventions. Again, these amendments should provide greater flexibility for the school officials without violating the personal and due process of students with disabilities as well as their parents. This is so stupid. In 2004, President Bush signed the IDEIA into law. The amendments of IDEA, which required each state must establish goals that address graduation rates and dropout rates, as well as other factors the state may determine. IDEIA set clearer parameters for children to receive free appropriate public education, or FAPE, consistent with their individual needs. Under IDEIA, states must also ensure policies are created to provide due process rights for all children with disabilities, as well as include a goal and timetable to accomplish these goals. The personnel, facilities, and related services necessary to meet the needs of children with disabilities, and a system for allocating funds to local school districts. The changes brought by IDEIA can best be seen when compared to the 1997 IDEA. The IDEIA states that all special education teachers do fall under the No Child Left Behind definition, whereas in 1997, special education teachers did not fall under the No Child Left Behind's definition of a highly qualified teacher. In 1997, there was no funding formula that included per pupil expenditures in the United States based on a current fiscal year. But IDEIA states that funds are allocated to state and local educational agencies for special education and related services based on pure average pupil expenditure in the United States during the current fiscal year. IDEIA also has a 60-day timetable established from receipt of parental consent for evaluation regarding a determination of eligibility and the educational needs of the child. This is a stark contrast to 1997, where no such timeline for parental consent or determination of eligibility had been established. In 1997, transition services did not specify the age of children with disabilities, but under IDEIA, transition services are now required when a disabled child reaches age 16. An Individual's Education Program, or IEP, in the IDEIA 2004 states the Secretary of Education is authorized to approve proposals for up to 15 states to allow school districts to develop a multi-year IEP for a maximum of 3 years with parental consent. The IEP may not necessarily be reviewed annually. Short-term objectives are no longer required, except for children who are meeting alternative assessment requirements and or students with the most significant cognitive abilities. This is a change from 1997, where school personnel in all school districts were required to review and revise the IEP annually, and the short-term objectives were required of all children with disabilities as part of their IEP. Under IDEIA, comparable related services must be provided to a disabled child who transferred to a new school district in his or her state within the same school year. In 1997, provisions of the IEP did not require that comparable related services be provided. The burden shifted from schools to parents who must demonstrate that the child's behavior was not substantially related to his or her disability under IDEIA 2004, which is the opposite of the provision in 1997. School personnel may consider on a case-by-case basis the unique circumstances when deciding whether to prescribe a change in placement for a child with disabilities who violates a code of conduct, whereas in 1997, there was limited discretion to schools to determine this. Regarding attorney's fees, a state or local education agency may be awarded attorney's fees if they prevail based on frivolous or unreasonable complaints by parents or attorneys. However, in 1997, these attorney fees were awarded to parents who filed a substantive complaint regarding their rights or the rights of a child with a disability. The stay put provision in IDEIA is eliminated for alleged violations of a school code that may result in removal from students' current educational placement for more than 10 days. In 1997, students with disabilities were permitted to remain in their current placement, pending an appeal regarding violations involving drugs or other dangerous activity. In 1997, all IEP team members were required to attend the annual program review meeting, and the changes to a child's IEP were necessary after these annual meetings. Under IDEIA, a member of the IEP team shall not be required to attend all or part of the IEP meeting if the parent in writing and school district agree that the team member's attendance is not necessary because this area is not being modified or discussed during the team meeting. This is something that is very true in my current classroom, as there have been many IEP meetings where the school speech language pathologist or occupational therapist have not been attended in the IEP meeting, as the child's progress does not warrant a change under this. After reviewing the ongoing revisions and amendments passed, it is important that educators recognize that no student with a disability should be excluded from receiving a free, appropriate public education. Knowledge is absolute power when it comes to teaching, and knowing what is expected of general education teachers as well as special education teachers will only serve to ensure that all students with disabilities are receiving the type of education that is appropriate for them regarding their IEPs and any other accommodations necessary.